The town of Maple Hollow wasn't much. Just one main street, two diners, and a post office where everyone knew your name and who your grandfather voted for. It was quiet, the kind of place where life moved like molasses and secrets travelled faster than sound. Margaret Sinclair had lived here all her life. At 68, the retired English teacher was known for her collection of antique books, her deep love for Emily Dickinson, and the way she made the best lemon pie in the county fair. 5 years running. After her husband passed, things became quieter. Her days were filled with crossword puzzles, tea with neighbours, and the occasional visit from her son, Stephen. But when he and his wife Tina suggested she move in with them, she said yes. It felt right at the time. A family sticking together. What could be wrong with that? Their home was in a newer part of town, a modest beige bungalow with a garden Margaret secretly adored. "You won't have to worry about anything, Mom," Stephen had said, arms around her shoulders. "You just focus on enjoying your golden years." At first, she did. She helped cook, kept the house neat, even took care of their daughter Lily when daycare was closed. It felt like a new rhythm, one she was willing to dance to. But soon the music changed. It started with silence. Stephen no longer lingered over coffee. Tina's smiles became tight, forced. The clinking of plates in the evening was followed by murmurs in the kitchen, behind walls not thick enough. One night, as Margaret walked quietly down the hallway to fetch her reading glasses, she caught a phrase that stuck like a thorn. "Don't you think she's been here long enough?" It was Tina, her voice sharp and low. Stephen replied with a sigh. "I know, but what do you want me to do?" "She's my mother. She's always around. I feel like we don't even have our own space anymore." Margaret stood frozen, her hand resting on the doorframe, her reading glasses forgotten. That night, in the guest room that used to be Lily's nursery, she stared at the ceiling and listened. Not to the old creaks of a settling house, but to the subtle unravelling of love. They weren't yelling, they weren't cruel. But in those whispered complaints, Margaret heard a deeper truth. She was becoming an inconvenience. And for a woman who once commanded classrooms and calmed storms of teenage angst with a raised brow, this quiet dismissal hurt in ways no teenager ever had. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. There was a time Margaret would wake up to the smell of pancakes and the gentle sound of Lily's giggles echoing down the hall. Tina would hand her a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just the way she liked it. And Stephen would ask how she slept with genuine interest in his eyes. Those mornings were gone now. The house still stood, beige and still, but inside, something essential had shifted. Where warmth once lived, there was now a chill, polite, unspoken, and sharp as ice. Margaret noticed it first in the kitchen. One morning she reached for the skillet to make her signature scrambled eggs, something Lily always asked for. Tina was already in the kitchen chopping vegetables with practiced precision. "Oh, I thought I'd cook breakfast today," Margaret said, reaching for the eggs. Tina didn't look up. "I've got it." "I don't mind, really, I said, I've got it." The words weren't loud, but they were heavy, final. Margaret stood there for a moment, then nodded and quietly stepped back. She took her coffee to the small patio instead, wrapping her cardigan tighter as the morning sun failed to warm her. Stephen, once her sweet boy who used to crawl into her lap with dinosaur books and ask her to read until he fell asleep, now seemed busy. Always busy. Early mornings, late nights, business trips she hadn't even heard about until after the fact. When they did cross paths, it was brief. "How's work?" she'd ask. "Same," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "Lily's recital is next week. She's excited." "Yeah, Tina told me." The conversations ended before they began. Margaret tried not to take it personally. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe they needed space. But it was hard not to notice how her presence had gone from welcome to tolerated, and now barely acknowledged. Even Lily had started mimicking her parents' behaviour. No more hugs that lasted too long. No more asking Grandma to braid her hair or read a bedtime story. Now it was, Mum says I should let her tuck me in. And when Margaret sat on the couch beside Tina one evening to watch a movie, Tina stood up within minutes. I'll watch this later. I've got laundry. The silence left in her wake was deafening. Margaret sat alone, the glow of the TV washing over her as voices flickered on the screen. But she wasn't watching. Not really. She had never thought love could turn invisible. It was a Thursday, ordinary in every way. The kind of day that slips by unnoticed in the rhythm of routine. Rain had tapped softly against the windows since morning, the sky a dull grey that seemed to seep into the walls of the house. Margaret had spent the afternoons sorting through old books in her room, trying to decide which she might donate to the library. Each title carried a memory, a classroom, a student. She traced the spines gently, like touching old friends. At 6, she smelled dinner. Garlic, tomato sauce, the faint sizzle of something in a pan. She smiled, closed the book she'd been reading, and made her way down the hallway. Her steps were slow but steady, her hands lightly brushing the wall as she walked. In the dining room, the table was already set. The light above cast a soft glow over the plates. 3 plates, not 4. Tina was placing a bowl of salad in the centre. Lily was already seated, kicking her legs beneath the table. Stephen poured water into his glass. Margaret stood at the doorway for a moment too long. Tina glanced up. "Oh," she said, "we thought you already ate." There was no apology in her voice, just a hollow sort of indifference. "I didn't," Margaret replied softly. "Well, there's still food, if you're hungry." No one stood, no one moved to add a plate. The air was thick with the kind of silence that says everything. Margaret nodded once, just enough to acknowledge she'd heard. She turned and walked into the kitchen. She didn't want pasta anymore. She didn't want anything that came with explanations or sighs. She found 2 slices of bread, dropped them into the toaster. The hum of the appliance filled the kitchen like static in her ears. As she waited, she glanced at the corkboard by the fridge. Photos of Lily at school, Tina's yoga schedule, Stephen's dry cleaning ticket. Nothing of hers. Nothing to suggest she belonged here at all. The toast popped up. She didn't bother with butter, just folded the slices onto a plate and took them back to her room, the room that had once been painted pink for a child who had outgrown it long ago. She sat on the edge of the bed, chewing slowly. In the next room, laughter broke out. Something Lily had said. Stephen chuckled. Tina joined in. Margaret stared at the door, her hands wrapped around her plate. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just got used to the silence. The living room was unusually quiet that evening. Outside, the branches of the sycamore trees swayed against the windows, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts along the walls. The TV played softly in the background, some old detective show Stephen liked to keep on for noise. Margaret sat in her corner armchair, knitting needles idle in her lap. The scarf she'd started 2 weeks ago hadn't grown much. Lately, she found herself staring off more than stitching. Stephen entered the room, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when something uncomfortable sat on his tongue. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, dropping into the recliner. "You got a second?" She looked over, gentle eyes meeting his. Of course. He hesitated, fingers tapping against his knee. The silence stretched. Then, as if pulling off a Band-Aid, he said, I was just thinking, maybe it would be good for you to, I don't know, get away for a bit. Just take some time, somewhere calm, peaceful. Margaret didn't respond, but her stillness was louder than any gasp. Stephen cleared his throat. Like a senior living place. Just for a little while. You know, fresh air, no stress, your own space. Someplace that's built for, comfort. He said the words carefully as if dressing them up would soften their impact. But they landed heavy and unadorned. Her hands tightened around the yarn in her lap. She didn't look angry, just tired. Tired in a way he didn't recognize. Stephen rushed to fill the silence. It's not forever, it's just... Things have been tight lately. Tina's mom might be visiting soon, and Lily's school schedule is all over the place. We figured maybe... We? She asked quietly, her voice cutting through like a needle through fabric. Stephen looked away. It's just an idea, Mom. I thought you might actually enjoy it. Margaret smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I see. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't protest. That was what made it hurt more. Her calmness had a weight to it, like the silence before a storm that never comes. Stephen shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Anyway, just think about it. I will, she said, though they both knew she already had. That night, in her room, Margaret stared at the photo on her nightstand. It was from years ago, Stephen's graduation. Her arm around him, both of them beaming. She reached out and turned the frame face down. There are some wounds no one sees, especially the ones caused by those you love most. The house was louder than usual that Saturday evening. Tina's birthday party had brought in a dozen guests. Neighbours, co-workers, even a couple of friends from college who still laughed too loud and drank too much. The dining room table was lined with snacks, wine glasses, and a cake waiting to be unveiled. Margaret had offered to help, as she always did. She'd vacuumed the living room that morning, cleaned the guest bathroom, and now she was in the kitchen, wiping down countertops and clearing empty cups while the laughter flowed from the other room. She didn't mind not being included in the chatter. She wasn't part of that world anymore. But helping made her feel useful, like she still had a place. The moment happened quickly. She reached for a wine glass that teetered too close to the edge of the counter, but her sleeve caught the neck of a tall, half-empty bottle of red wine. It crashed to the floor. The sound of shattering glass silenced the room like a gunshot. Everyone turned. Tina was the first to move. She stepped into the kitchen, eyes wide, but not with concern, with fury. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped. "That was from Napa. Stephen's boss gave us that." Margaret bent down immediately, her hands trembling as she picked up the jagged pieces with a dish towel. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean—" "You never mean to," Tina said, arms folded. "But somehow, things just keep getting ruined when you're around." Margaret paused, still crouched on the floor. The words weren't just angry, they were precise, designed to cut. Tina wasn't finished. This was supposed to be my night. One thing, just one thing, and you still managed to make it about you. Stephen appeared in the doorway then, silent as ever. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't even speak. Margaret stood up slowly, placing the broken glass on the counter. Her hands were still shaking, not from the mess, but from the clarity. This wasn't her home, not anymore. The laughter didn't resume after that. The party dragged on, but the energy had shifted. Margaret retreated to her room without another word. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the dark window pane. It wasn't the glass that had shattered that night. It was the illusion that she belonged here. The morning after Tina's birthday felt strangely still. The leftover smell of vanilla candles clung to the air, and empty wine glasses dotted the counters like forgotten memories. The laughter, the music, the raised voices, it had all dissolved, leaving only echoes. Margaret was up early, as always. Old habits. She boiled water for tea, moving slowly, careful not to touch anything she didn't need to. She no longer felt welcome in the kitchen, but it was muscle memory now. Quiet rituals in a home that no longer belonged to her. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Stephen. He looked tired, hungover maybe, but there was something else in his eyes, something resolved. "Mom," he said. She waited. He shifted his weight, rubbed his jaw like he always did before difficult conversations. I think it might be time to take a little break." Margaret didn't blink. A break? Just some time. Away. For you. For us. Maybe stay at one of those assisted living places for a few weeks, something peaceful. You'd get space and we'd get a chance to reset too. There it was. Not whispered behind a wall. Not passed off as suggestion. It was plain now. Final. Delivered directly to her face to face. With all the gentle packaging in the world, it was still an eviction. She stared at him, the man she'd raised. She remembered the feel of his small hand gripping hers on his first day of school. The way he used to cry when he scraped his knee, only calming down when she hummed his favourite lullaby. Now he stood there, asking her to go, because it would be good for everyone. Her throat tightened, not with words but with restraint. She nodded. A small, almost imperceptible motion, but inside her something was coming undone. A quiet, tearing force that didn't scream, but cracked her in two. Stephen seemed relieved. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." She said nothing. He turned and left the kitchen. Margaret stood there, staring at the steaming mug in her hands. Understand? She understood more than he could imagine. She understood what it meant to raise a child with everything you had, only to become an afterthought. She understood what it meant to give and give until nothing was left for yourself. And she understood, finally, that this house was not her home. Not anymore. The tea sat untouched on the counter as she turned, walked back to her room, and quietly opened the closet. It was time. The house was dark when Stephen and Tina returned that night. Rain pattered against the windows and the hallway lights cast long yellow beams across the hardwood floor. Stephen hung his coat by the door. Tina kicked off her heels with a sigh. "Finally," she muttered, "a night without drama." They passed the living room without a glance, their minds already focused on the comfort of bed and silence. But when Tina went to the guest bathroom, she paused. The door to Margaret's room, usually closed, was ajar. And it was too quiet. "Stephen," she called out. He walked over confused. "What?" She pushed the door open fully. The room was empty, not just quiet, empty. The closet doors stood open, the hangers bare. The drawers were pulled out, neatly vacated. The small ceramic lamp on the nightstand still glowed, casting a warm light on the made bed. And on the bed, in the centre of the floral quilt, lay a single sheet of paper. Folded. Tina picked it up, her face tightening as she read aloud. "You wanted me gone. The truth is, I was already on my way out. I packed before you even asked. Thank you for confirming I made the right choice." "Margaret." Stephen said nothing. He stared at the bed, then at the bare dresser where his mother's photo frame used to be. "She left?" he asked, like the words couldn't quite settle in his throat. "No bags, no sound. She just walked out." Tina looked around, her voice low. "She's gone, Stephen. Really gone." In the silence that followed, the air in the room felt heavier than it should, as if it remembered everything said within its walls, All the whispered complaints, the cold glances, the plate never set. Margaret had taken her presence with her. But she'd left behind the echo. Stephen picked up the note, holding it in both hands like it might explain something, like it might change something. But it didn't. The message was clear. She hadn't been pushed out. She had already let go. The apartment wasn't much. A second-floor unit in a weathered brick building just outside of town. No concierge, no granite countertops. Just a small balcony with a chipped railing and the steady hum of cicadas after sunset. But it was hers. Margaret turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sound echoed slightly against the bare walls, but she didn't mind the emptiness. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel like she was walking on glass. The furniture was minimal. A small couch she'd found second-hand, a pine table with 2 chairs, a bed with a firm mattress that hadn't yet learned the shape of her body. A bookshelf stood in the corner, already half-filled with the volumes she'd taken with her. Austen, Dickinson, Baldwin, Steinbeck. Old friends. She walked over to the kitchenette and put on the kettle. No one to say the water was already boiled, no one to look past her like she was furniture. There was only silence, and it wasn't the suffocating kind she'd known before. This was different. This was quiet that embraced her, quiet that asked nothing. She moved slowly, carefully unpacking the last of her dishes. A simple white mug, a plate with a faint chip on the edge. Things that had no place in Stephen and Tina's pristine home, but here, they belonged. As the kettle whistled, she poured herself a cup of tea and stepped out onto the narrow balcony. The street below was quiet, lit by a flickering lamppost and the occasional passing car. She leaned on the railing, watching shadows stretch across the pavement. She was alone, but not lonely. There was a difference, a profound, powerful one. No one would knock on her door asking her to leave the kitchen. No one would forget to set a plate for her. No one would suggest, softly, cruelly, that she go someplace else. She had already arrived. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth seeping through her hands. In this small apartment, she had space to breathe, to read, to think, to rediscover the woman who had spent a lifetime caring for others and had almost forgotten what it felt like to care for herself. And though the air was still inside her, something had begun to move. Not bitterness, not regret, something steadier, like peace. Margaret didn't expect the letter, not after all those years. It arrived in a plain white envelope, tucked between a phone bill and a grocery flyer. The handwriting on the front was uneven, as if written in a rush. She opened it at the kitchen table, her tea still steaming beside her. Dear Mrs. Sinclair, I'm not sure if you remember me. Andrew Lewis, class of 2004. You once told me I had a voice worth sharing. I didn't believe you then, but I do now. I just wanted to say thank you. Some teachers fade from memory. You didn't. Andrew. She read the letter twice, then folded it slowly, pressing it to her chest. For the first time since leaving Stephen's house, she cried. Not from sadness, but from the feeling of being seen. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, more messages trickled in. Emails, postcards. A Facebook message from a girl named Delilah, who used to doodle all over her poetry assignments. You're the reason I studied literature. I still quote you when I teach my own students. Word had spread that Mrs. Sinclair, the Mrs. Sinclair, had moved back into town. Margaret hadn't realised she was missed. One afternoon, she walked down to the local library to return a book and was approached by a young woman with a clipboard and a nervous smile. Are you Mrs. Sinclair? Margaret blinked. Yes? I'm Sarah from the Maple Hollow Community Centre. We're starting a free learning programme for kids who fell behind during COVID. Someone said you used to teach. I did, Margaret said softly. The young woman looked hopeful. Would you consider volunteering? Even one afternoon a week would mean the world to them. Margaret smiled. 1 week later, she stood in a sunlit classroom at the community centre, whiteboard marker in hand. Her students were 6 middle schoolers and 2 high school freshmen, all fidgety, distracted, and unsure how to react to her calm authority. But within minutes, they listened, because she hadn't lost it. The voice, the presence, the quiet command that made a room pay attention, not from fear, but from respect. When she asked who'd heard of Maya Angelou, 3 hands went up. By the end of the hour, all 8 had memorized the first stanza of Still I Rise. Margaret walked home that day with a bounce in her step she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just existing anymore. She was becoming herself again. It started, as many unexpected joys do, in the cereal aisle. Margaret had gone to the local grocery store for her usual staples: tea, oat milk, a loaf of rye bread, and had just reached for a box of granola when a familiar voice called out behind her. "Margaret Sinclair, is that really you?" She turned. There, standing beside a cart filled with organic kale and peanut butter crackers, was Joan Weaver, her old neighbour, bridge partner, and fellow widow from back when the world still made sense. Joan looked older, of course, thinner, her silver hair tied up in a messy bun. But the eyes were the same, sharp, mischievous, full of that fire Margaret had always admired. Margaret smiled. "Joan, I thought you moved to Florida." "I did. Hated it." Joan laughed. "Humidity and gators weren't for me, so I came back. Widows can roam, you know." They embraced there between the Cheerios and the canned peaches, 2 women who had weathered more than they ever expected and were still standing. Over coffee the next morning, Joan caught Margaret up on the years that had passed. "My Harold died 4 summers ago," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "At first, I didn't know who I was without him, so I started reading again. Then I started a book club." "A book club?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. Joan nodded. "Every Thursday, in my sunroom. We drink too much wine and pretend to hate romance novels. You should come." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I'd love to." The first meeting she attended was a little chaotic. 7 women, 2 bottles of Merlot, and 1 spirited debate about whether the main character in the month's novel was a feminist or just emotionally unavailable. Margaret sat quietly at first, soaking in the warmth of the room, the laughter, the casual way everyone interrupted each other without offence. It felt like walking into a house where the heat had been turned on just before winter. When she finally spoke, quoting a line from the book and offering a perspective none of the others had considered, the room went still. Then, slowly, heads nodded. "You still got it, Maggie," Joan said with a grin. That night, Margaret walked home with a paperback under her arm and something else, something weightless and rare, settling in her chest. She was part of something again, and that mattered more than she realised. It started with a story. One Thursday evening, after the group had dissected a particularly predictable thriller and were halfway through their second bottle of wine, Joan made an offhand comment about her daughter-in-law's recent suggestion that she move into a retirement home. "I told her she could move into one first," Joan snapped, eliciting a round of laughter. But then another voice chimed in. "She told me the same last year," said Carol, the soft-spoken widow who rarely contributed more than a murmur. "Said I was too much to handle." Eyes turned, and slowly stories emerged. Tales of grown children treating their mothers like burdens, of sacrifices long forgotten, of affection replaced with polite distance. Margaret sat quietly, listening, and then, without thinking, she spoke. "I was living with my son and his wife until recently," she began. "They never raised their voices, but their silence, it pushed harder than any words ever could." The room stilled. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. "I left because they wanted me gone. What they didn't know is I had already left them in my heart weeks before. I just hadn't packed yet." That night changed something. The following week, Margaret brought a few printed pamphlets, information on elder rights, legal protections, and community support groups, things she'd quietly researched in the sleepless nights after she left Stephen's house. Joan offered to let her speak at the next meeting. Not about a novel, but about boundaries, about being mothers, not martyrs, about saying no without guilt and enough without shame. And so she did. She stood at the front of Joan's sunroom, a space once reserved for fictional stories, and told her own. She talked about invisibility, about being needed until you're not, about the quiet erosion of dignity when love becomes obligation. The women listened. Some cried. Others nodded. One even clutched her hand when the meeting ended and whispered, "You said exactly what I've been too afraid to admit." In the weeks that followed, the group grew. Neighbours brought friends. Younger women showed up too, daughters trying to understand their mothers, women worried they were becoming their own versions of forgotten. Margaret began writing again, this time essays, reflections, and speeches. She was invited to speak at a local community centre, then a regional women's network. Her voice carried further than she ever imagined. She was no longer just a retired teacher. She was a voice for the silent mothers, for the women asked to step aside after giving everything, for those told they'd had their turn. Margaret hadn't just reclaimed her life, she'd made it a banner. It wasn't planned. It never is. One of the younger women from the Thursday group, Emily, a tech-savvy 30-something who worked in marketing, had quietly recorded a few minutes of Margaret's last talk. She'd been moved by the way this silver-haired woman stood in front of a room full of strangers and spoke truths most people were too scared to say. Later that night, Emily edited the video into a short clip. It opened with Margaret's steady voice saying, "I raised a child with everything I had. And when I was no longer needed, I became invisible. So I left. And I built a life where I am not just seen, but valued." She uploaded the clip with a simple caption. "An abandoned mother finds power in solitude and reminds us all what real strength looks like. Forgotten more. Mothers are people, too." She didn't expect much, but within 12 hours, the video had over 20,000 views. By the next morning, it was on fire. Thousands of comments poured in. "This is my mother's story. I just texted her. I told her I see her now. I'm crying in a parking lot. She said everything my heart's been screaming. Why do we only value mothers when we need them? She's right. We owe them more." Margaret's inbox filled with messages from women in Missouri, New Jersey, Oregon, from men who hadn't spoken to their mothers in years, from caregivers, social workers, and daughters trying to do better. The local news picked it up. Then a national morning show reached out. Joan called in tears. "Margaret, you're famous. I mean, really famous." But Margaret didn't feel like a celebrity. She felt heard. The part of her that had spent nights wondering if she was overreacting, if leaving Stephen's house had been selfish, now saw proof that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the exception. She was the echo of thousands. That week, she gave her first live-streamed talk at the Maple Hollow Community Centre. The room was packed. People stood along the walls, sitting on floors, craning their necks just to hear her speak. She wore a soft blue sweater and no makeup. She didn't pretend to be more than she was. That was the point. "I am not a victim," she said calmly. "I am a woman who chose herself. And in doing so, I found others who needed to hear that it's not only okay, but necessary." Applause didn't just come from the room. It came from across the country. It was Lily who first noticed it. Sitting at the kitchen table, cereal bowl in hand, she looked up from her iPad and said, "Dad, isn't this Grandma?" Stephen, mid-bite, turned. There she was. Margaret, on YouTube. Hair pinned neatly, a soft scarf over her shoulders, seated in front of a bookshelf filled with dog-eared classics. The video title read, "What Happens to Mothers When No One's Watching." Margaret Sinclair speaks out. Stephen set his spoon down slowly. Tina walked over, arms crossed. "That's from the segment on Morning News," she said. "It's everywhere. Facebook, TikTok, even LinkedIn." They watched in silence. We tell mothers to give, to care, to sacrifice, but no one prepares us for the day we're told, without words, that our usefulness has expired. The comments below were brutal. "I hope her son is watching this and crumbling with guilt. If I ever treat my mum like this, someone slap me. This woman is a saint. And a warning." Stephen closed the laptop. Silence settled between them like fog. "She made us look like monsters," Tina said. "No," Stephen replied, voice lower. "She didn't have to. We did that ourselves." He left the room. That night he sat in the garage for an hour, alone, staring at the dusty shelves. His childhood soccer trophies, an old drill set his dad left behind, and now, guilt. It buzzed in his ears like static. Shame he didn't know how to carry, or how to speak. He thought about that last conversation. "A little break," he'd said, as if exiling your mother was an administrative decision. She had left with quiet dignity, and now she was being celebrated for it. He opened his phone, searched her name. There were videos, articles, a podcast, a small non-profit she'd helped launch called the Second Bloom Project, offering support and shelter for elderly women who had been displaced by their families. One photo stopped him cold. Margaret, standing before a crowd of women, holding a microphone, smiling. Not the tight, polite smile he remembered, but a wide, radiant one, the kind that only comes when no one owns you anymore. He didn't know what to feel. Part of him wanted to drive to her apartment, to apologize, to fall at her feet. Another part, the prideful, stubborn part, stayed seated. "She's doing fine without me," he whispered. But deep inside, another truth whispered louder. She didn't need to. She just had to. The law office was quiet, save for the ticking of a brass clock on the bookshelf and the occasional rustle of papers. Margaret sat across from her attorney, Evelyn Chan, a sharp, soft-spoken woman with silver-rimmed glasses and the kind of focus that made people sit up straighter. "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked gently, flipping to the final page of the updated document. "I've never been more sure of anything," Margaret replied, her voice calm, clear. "This isn't about revenge. It's about clarity." The will was brief to the point. Clean lines, no loopholes. Her savings, accumulated through a lifetime of careful budgeting, her pension, the sale of her late husband's cabin, and a few unexpected royalties from her recent publishing, would be split evenly between two causes: the Willow Foundation, a network of shelters for older women estranged from family, a scholarship fund for retired public school teachers who wanted to return to education through volunteer work. Stephen's name didn't appear. Not even in a footnote. Margaret leaned back in the leather chair as Evelyn notarized the final page. I raised him the best I could, she said quietly. But what he did wasn't just disappointing. It was erasure. He didn't see me as a person anymore. Just an obstacle to convenience. She paused, then added, I won't spend what's left of my life financing that kind of forgetting. Evelyn nodded. You're not the first to say those words, but you're the first who said them with peace instead of anger. Margaret smiled faintly. Anger only burns you. Peace reclaims you. She left the office with a copy of the updated will tucked inside her canvas tote, nestled between a paperback novel and a pack of chamomile tea. That evening she sat on her small balcony with the city lights flickering beyond the trees. She thought of all the years she had lived for others. The quiet dinners, the school projects, the forgotten birthdays, the sacrifices no one noticed until they were gone. And now, finally, her final act would be one she chose. Not for legacy, not for validation, but for meaning. Across town, Stephen scrolled through social media once again. Another post about his mother's recent talk, another article titled, Margaret Sinclair, the woman who walked out and never looked back. He didn't know it yet, but one day, years later, he would sit in a lawyer's office and hear her name. And when he asked about her estate, he'd be handed a single envelope. Inside would be a note, handwritten. I loved you even when you forgot how to love me. But love without respect isn't love at all. So I left you with the one thing you needed most. A lesson. It was a grey Tuesday afternoon when the phone rang. Margaret had just returned from the community centre, her canvas bag filled with handwritten essays from her Thursday class. She placed the kettle on the stove, slipped out of her walking shoes, and checked the screen. Stephen. Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment. It had been months. No messages, no apologies, just silence. The screen blinked. Incoming call. She pressed accept. There was a beat of static, then his voice. Tentative, unsure. Hi, Mom. Margaret didn't answer right away. I've been meaning to call. It's just, things have been crazy. She remained silent, letting him sit in his own sentence. Lily's been asking about you, he continued. She saw your video again. Said she misses you. Another pause. She drew a picture last week. It was the three of us. You were in the middle, holding hands. The words floated there, carefully chosen, not quite a lie, not quite honest. I know things got complicated, he added, but maybe you could visit, just for dinner, for the girls. They'd love to see you. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, the sound of Lily's giggles returned to her. The way her small fingers used to curl around hers at bedtime, the scent of apples in her hair, and then Tina's voice. You always ruin everything. And Stephen's silence. It's just for a while, Mom. You'll be more comfortable somewhere else. She opened her eyes. Her voice was quiet, measured. Not angry, just tired of pretending. Don't play games with me, Stephen. He went silent on the other end. I was never good enough for your house. Don't try to make me entertainment now that I have a voice. Mom, that's not what this is. I hope your daughters grow up to be strong women. Strong enough to know when they're being used. There was a small intake of breath. And then she hung up. No drama. No final word. Just a quiet click and the soft whistle of the kettle beginning to boil behind her. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, watched the wind move through the trees. And for the first time in years, she didn't wonder if she had done the right thing. She knew she had. It was a crisp Sunday morning. Margaret was watering the small violets on her balcony, the air laced with the scent of early spring. When the doorbell rang, she froze. Very few people visited unannounced. Most texted first. Book club wasn't until Thursday and the mail had already come. She stepped inside and opened the door. Tina stood there. Her hair was pulled back into a bun that had clearly lost its structure hours ago. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She looked smaller than Margaret remembered, deflated. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tina whispered, "Hi." Margaret remained in the doorway, unmoving. "I didn't know if you'd open the door," Tina continued, voice trembling. "I wasn't even sure I should come, but I had to." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Tina blinked, caught off guard by the question. I came to say I'm sorry," she said. "I was cruel. I pushed you out. I acted like you were a problem to be solved instead of a person, and I was wrong." Margaret's gaze didn't soften. Tina stepped forward slightly. "I see you now. All the things you do, the women you help, the way people listen to you. I didn't see it before, and I should have." Still, Margaret said nothing. Tina's voice cracked. "I didn't understand what you needed, or how I made you feel, but I do now. I swear, I do." Margaret finally spoke, calm, clear. "Do you?" Tina nodded eagerly. "Yes, I—" Margaret cut her off, eyes steady. "Do you regret what you did to me? Or do you regret that the world saw you do it?" Silence. Tina's mouth parted, but no words came. "Is this an apology?" Margaret continued, "or a brand rehabilitation?" Tina's lip quivered. "I deserve that." Margaret gave a slight nod. "You do." There was a long pause. "I'm not angry," Margaret said, voice softening just slightly. "But I've worked hard to build something true. I won't let it be used as a bridge back to your convenience." Tina's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it." Margaret considered her for a long moment. "Then don't come for me," she said gently. "Come for yourself. Show me in time, not in tears." She didn't slam the door, she just closed it slowly. Behind it, she leaned against the wall, heart pounding, not from pain, but from power. There is a difference between forgiveness and access, and Margaret had learned the cost of giving both too freely. The next afternoon, Tina returned. No makeup, no cameras, no carefully worded speeches, just a knock and silence. Margaret opened the door, already expecting her. Not because Tina had called, but because life has a rhythm. And when people begin to change or try to, they often return to the same doorstep, hoping it's still open. Tina didn't try to smile this time. "I'm not here for forgiveness," she said quietly. "I'm here because I don't know how to start fixing what I broke." Margaret stepped aside, allowing her to sit in the chair by the bookshelf. No tea, no polite small talk, just honesty. "I've been reading everything," Tina continued. "Watching your interviews, listening to how other women talk about what you gave them. You gave them language for what they never dared to say." She looked up, teary. "I didn't just silence you. I helped erase you, and I don't deserve to be in your life." Margaret listened, calm, still. "But I want to be," Tina whispered. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Her voice was neither cold nor warm, just even, measured. "If you want to be part of my life," she said, "you don't get to skip the work." Tina looked confused. "I'm not talking about a performance, not tears, not confessions. I mean actual change, internal, quiet, inconvenient. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real." Tina swallowed hard. "How?" "You start by asking yourself why it took the internet to show you my worth. You start by listening more than speaking. And you never ask for a seat at my table until you've built one of your own." She leaned forward slightly. I'm not looking for an apology anymore. I'm looking for evidence. The words hung in the air, not cruel, but clear as a bell in winter air. Tina lowered her head. I understand. Margaret nodded once. You're welcome to try, but you will do so from a distance. No visits, no favours, not until you've changed not just your words, but your wiring. Tina stood slowly. She looked older than she had even a day ago. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret didn't reply. She watched Tina walk down the hallway, out the building, and into the fading afternoon light. For the first time, Margaret felt something rare. Not triumph, not revenge, but alignment. Her love was not gone. It was just protected now. And that was enough. The auditorium smelled of old wood, floor wax, and freshly printed programs. It was the same stage where Margaret had once stood as a young teacher, calling roll call with chalk dust on her fingertips and hope in her chest. Now, decades later, the banner above her read, Honouring Margaret Sinclair, Voice, Mentor, Mother of the Forgotten. The room was packed. Teachers, students, parents, city officials, even the mayor had shown up, seated awkwardly between rows of teenagers fidgeting with their phones. Margaret walked slowly to the podium, her soft grey shawl draped over her shoulders, and a single index card in her hand. Not because she needed notes, but because habit was hard to unlearn. The applause began before she even spoke. It grew louder, louder still, until the entire auditorium rose to its feet. Hundreds of students, teachers, and strangers clapping for a woman who had once been asked to make herself small. She smiled gently, resting one hand on the podium. When the noise finally quieted, she leaned forward and began. I used to believe that silence was the highest form of grace, that being needed was the same as being loved, and that to give everything was the point. But I learned that silence can be a cage, that being needed isn't the same as being seen, and that there comes a time in every woman's life when she must stop handing out pieces of herself like candy and start protecting what's left. That time came for me, and I chose myself, not because I stopped loving, but because I finally started loving me. She looked up. There were tears in the audience, teachers nodding, students wide-eyed. One girl in the front row whispered to her friend, I want to be her when I grow up. Miles away, in a 2-story suburban house, Stephen sat on the edge of his couch. He had just gotten home from work. His tie was still on, loosened. The TV was on in the background, local news. He didn't realise what he was watching at first. But then he heard her voice. He turned, frozen. The screen showed Margaret at the podium, radiant, powerful, more alive than he had ever seen her inside his home. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't blink. He watched her finish her speech. He watched the standing ovation. And when the anchor said, Margaret Sinclair's story has sparked a national conversation about elder rights and maternal dignity, he lowered his face into his hands and wept, not just from guilt, but from the unbearable realization that the woman he once dismissed as quiet, ordinary, even burdensome, was now someone the world couldn't stop listening to. And he had missed it. It came on a Tuesday. No return address, no email, no text to warn it was coming. Just a pale blue envelope, handwritten, tucked between a local circular and the gas bill. Margaret recognised the handwriting instantly. Stephen. She stared at it for a while. She didn't open it right away. She placed it on her desk, brewed a cup of tea, folded a fresh blanket across the couch. She watered the violets on her balcony. Only when the house was quiet again, truly still, did she sit down and break the seal. The letter was short, written on thick paper, in the same looping print he used as a boy when he labelled his school folders with dinosaurs and race cars. Mum, I don't know where to begin, except to say, I didn't see you. I saw the convenience, the help, the space you took up. But not you. I watched your speech. I watched every second. And for the first time, I heard your voice, not as my mother, but as a person, a woman, a leader, a fighter. You taught me how to write, how to speak, how to work hard, but I never let you teach me how to love you. Now, I'm listening. I'm still your son. But now, I think I'm also your student. Because whatever being a mother truly means, I'm learning it from you. I love you. I'm sorry, I'll wait. Steve and Margaret sat at the window for a long time after reading it. She didn't cry at first. She simply held the letter between her palms like something fragile, something that could crumble if pressed too hard. Then the tears came, slow, quiet, without effort. Not because the words hurt, but because they didn't try to fix anything. They just told the truth. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her journal between 2 pages she had once filled with thoughts about being unseen, unheard, unneeded. Now she had no need to add to those pages. Stephen had said what he needed to say. And Margaret had no need to write back, not because she was angry, not because she didn't believe him, but because some answers live in space, in patience, in letting someone else carry the silence for once. She returned to her day, to her students, to the community she had chosen, to the life she had built, brick by quiet brick. And in the quiet corner of her desk drawer, the letter remained, unread again, but not forgotten, just like her. The interview was held in a small community theatre, converted for the day into a makeshift studio, a single armchair, 2 cameras, and the gentle hum of stage lights overhead. Margaret wore a soft grey blazer and her signature blue scarf. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Across from her sat a young journalist, barely 30, voice trembling slightly with awe. Mrs. Sinclair, she began, you've become a national symbol of dignity, boundaries, and elder empowerment. You've inspired thousands. If you could share one truth with women who feel like you once did, forgotten, dismissed, what would it be? Margaret paused, looking not at the interviewer but past her, as if speaking directly to the women on the other side of the lens, the ones watching in silence, in pain, in kitchens too quiet, in guest rooms never meant to be theirs. Then she smiled, not a performative smile, but a real one, the kind that blooms from truth. When they tried to throw me out, she said slowly, I had already left. But this time I didn't just leave their house. I left the version of me that waited for permission to matter. And I didn't go empty. I walked toward myself, and when I got there, I was greeted with love. The room fell still, not the stunned silence of shock, but the reverent quiet that follows something sacred. Later that night, the interview aired across networks. Clips flooded the internet. Quotes appeared on posters, blogs, podcasts. Her face, kind, strong, luminous, became a banner not just for aging with grace, but for living with intention. In a small apartment above a bakery, Margaret brewed her tea. She sat on her balcony wrapped in a blanket, stars blinking softly overhead. In her lap lay a copy of her newly published book, Leaving Loud, The Power of Going Quietly. Below, on the sidewalk, a girl no older than 12 walked past with her mother. Isn't that the lady from the video? the girl asked. Her mother looked up, smiled, and waved gently. Margaret nodded back, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had once been erased and then rewrote herself. From a mother forgotten to a woman remembered, and most of all, to a soul reclaimed.